Today, we are hosting Sophie Chao. Sophie will be talking to us about the promise of multi-species justice. Sophie is actually joining us from Sydney, which is a great honor that she made the time to join us her evening time. And she's a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Sydney. Her research investigates the intersections of indigeneity, ecology, capitalism, health, and justice in the Pacific. Chao has authored In the Shadow of the Palms, More Than Human Becomings in West Papua, and co-edited The Promise of Multispecies Justice, which is also the topic of her webinar today. She previously worked for the indigenous rights organization Forest Peoples Program and is of Sino-French heritage, living on unceded Gadigal lands in Sydney, Australia. And you can see more information on our websites for Sophie and also her own website, More Than Human Worlds. So I'll stop sharing screen and just give the word to Sophie, just to say if you want to follow the webinar series or write about it, tweet or post, we are using this hashtag for meets and probably a similar one for Go Just. So thank you very much, Sophie. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sophia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I want to start by thanking Sophia Efstathiou for inviting me to speak as part of the Go Just and Mitigation webinar series. And I want to thank all of you for making the time to be here at what I know is a relatively early hour and in the Greek summer, no less. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with all of you. As Sophia noted, what I'm going to do in the next 35 or 40 minutes or so is to present to you some ideas and reflections on the theme of multi-species justice, an emergent interdisciplinary current that is seeking to expand the scope and the subjects of justice and the law beyond the individual and, importantly, beyond the human. I'm going to do so by drawing on my own research with Indigenous communities in West Papua, and also on an ongoing research project called The Promise of Multispecies Justice that I've been co-leading with an artist researcher called Karen Bolender. You can read more about this project and our many collaborators at our website, multispeciesjustice.space, where you'll also find recorded talks by the many volume contributors and other emerging scholars of multi-species justice. So a lot of the work that fed into this multidisciplinary project was published in 2022 as an edited volume by the title of Promise of Multispecies Justice. And what I'm going to do today is to pick out some of the key themes, concepts, and challenges that we as a collective encountered in our attempt to reimagine justice beyond the human being and beyond the individual subject of the law. But first, let me tell you a little bit about my own personal interest in the question of multi-species justice. This interest was first sparked during the course of my long-term ethnographic fieldwork among the indigenous marine peoples of West Papua, whom I've had the immense privilege to learn from and to think with over the last decade. I first encountered the marine peoples when I was working for a human rights organization called the Forest Peoples Program. And at that time, I was conducting extensive investigative research and advocacy on human rights abuses that were being caused by deforestation and the expansion of industrial oil palm plantations across marine forests, lands, and territories, including the violation of their right to livelihoods, environment, culture, food, and water. What became increasingly clear to me over the course of this ethnographic research was that my marine friends did not conceptualize rights, responsibilities, or indeed the law itself as a human-only phenomenon, either in terms of their objects or subjects. Social justice was to them very much inseparable from environmental justice, and the well-being of plants, animals, elements, atmospheres, and ecosystems was seen to be integral to the well-being of human communities and vice versa. The notion that nature and culture in the first instance existed as separate domains was also alien to many of my companions, who very much saw themselves as belonging to land and bound to the laws of the land, rather than the opposite. Relationships and relationality were the key operatives in marine philosophies, practices, and protocols of more than human coexistence, as indeed they are for indigenous peoples across the world. And marine have no word, indeed, for what we might call environment or nature. Rather, they speak of the entities that compose what we call environment or nature through idioms of kinship, shared ancestry, intergenerational bonds, and agentive, sentient communities of life. As I was doing this fieldwork on an emergent plantation frontier, the kinds of indigenous epistemology that I was encountering brought up for me a range of difficult questions that have stayed with me long after I left the field. What kind of legal and institutional transformations, I wondered, might be needed to genuinely recognize non-human beings as subjects of justice? How can we reconcile different epistemologies of nature in achieving justice for non-humans? How can we expand the scope of justice to encompass these other than human entities, whilst also remaining sensitive to the lives of those humans who continue to be treated as subhuman, non-human, not yet human, or killable before the law? In what ways, I was asking myself, do justice paradigms in the present and to come demand that we recognize and reckon with injustices caused by longer histories of colonial violence? And if humans bear responsibilities of care towards non-humans and the environment, then what are we to do with non-human beings that might also be drivers or agents of harm and amplified injustice? Oil palm plantations, lethal viruses, proliferating pests, damaging tsunamis, to name but a few. The picture I'm showing you right now is a piece of drone footage, incidentally, that was taken by one of my marine friends in West Papua, and that gives you a little bit of a sense of the scale of the ecological destruction that is being wrought by the arrival of industrial oil palm plantations in this region of West Papua. So the kinds of questions that I've offered for you very much lie at the heart of an emergent field known as multi-species justice studies, which, as I suggested, seeks to reconceptualize justice beyond the human realm and its implications for the ideological, political, and structural transformation of existing human institutions. Central to this emerging current is an acknowledgement that dominant existing frameworks for conceptualizing justice, the ways in which we imagine and represent justice, and the institutions for delivering justice are not up to task when it comes to attending to the multiple dimensions of injustice in already multi-species worlds. Specifically, the largely individualistic and anthropocentric ontologies that underpin virtually all theories and practices of justice in Western legal cultures are proving not to be fit for purpose when it comes to encompassing the needs, the relations, the interests, the communicative styles, and the life ways of non-humans as members of a diverse yet shared community of life. As such, the very possibility of political or legal institutions commencing this task of doing justice in a multi-species world requires, as a first step, acknowledging the very presence of beings who are not human, but who are also endowed with their own perceptual life worlds, biotic affordances, and ecological situatedness, all of which may and often are radically different to those of humans. This, in turn, calls on us to acknowledge the momentous, though not necessarily unsurmountable, challenges entailed in entering each other's life worlds and negotiating justice in a way that might honor all and different points of view, sentient or otherwise. This is the kind of transformative work that calls on us to do more than simply expand the rules of inclusion that constitute politics. Rather, it requires new political imaginaries that take into account the radical diversity of ways of being, the complexity of interspecies relationships, and the impossibility of full translation or communication across these multi-species worlds, even as we might be seeking to craft a shared space for reaching towards just arrangement and just outcomes. In the image of the multi-species, theorizing justice beyond the human invites a multidisciplinary cross-pollination of theories, practices, and methods. And this is precisely what my collaborators and I within the Promise of Multispecies Justice project attempted to do during the height of the 2020 pandemic summer, when we assembled an international crew in a Zoom room to share stories with glimmers of hope for people and for creatures who are united across geographical divides by shared experiences of violence, dispossession, and loss. Our collaborators, some of whom are featured on this slide here, included scholars in Indigenous studies, environmental justice, political theory, post-colonial studies, anthropology, theology, science and technology studies, feminist studies, philosophy, as well as some less conventional producers of knowledge. For instance, slime mold whisperers and activist poets, as well as science fiction writers and architects. Just as important as these diverse human thinkers and tinkerers are the array of other than human protagonists who animate our project. These include pesticides and stray dogs, viruses and oil palms, nuclear waste and rodent traps, prison gardens and feral species, and many more. It was by trying to think with these diverse non-human beings that we tried together over the course of 2 years to track the contours of justice as it traveled from courtrooms to protest movements in the streets, from the abstract realms of high theory to the more fleeting domain of ghosts, the dead, and of spirits. We were trying here to explore possibilities for intersectional alliances that might emerge across different peoples and species on the planet, and even the possibilities of transformative justice in extraterrestrial realms. What we found in the course of this collective project was that dominant hierarchies of life and of worth that tend to place humans above other species were and are, in fact, being subverted and resisted in many different cultural and ecological milieus. In Micronesia, for instance, where one of our Indigenous contributors is from, we were drawn to Indigenous practices for exalting the beauty of an endangered bird, a kingfisher with green, orange, and white feathers, even as at the same time, colonial extraction continues to produce extinction in Micronesia. In another case study centered on prisons in California, we explored how food gardens are offering glimpses of beauty and shared labor within a deeply flawed justice system, conjuring possibilities for a multi-species prison abolition movement to gain ground and grow. In yet another case study centered on the Colombian Amazon, we learned from anthropologists and legal scholars about inter-ethnic violence that perdures even as dreams and laws are proliferating about justice for nature and territory itself as a victim of war and violence. In these and many other geographic sites, we collectively asked ourselves, how does expanding the scope and subject of justice beyond the human and beyond the law invite new possibilities for decolonizing not just multi-species relations, but also the very concept and practice of justice itself? Expectedly, if perhaps disappointingly for many, our project does not offer an exhaustive or prescriptive concept of what multi-species justice is. Indeed, the horizons of justice that are represented in the collection are often themselves in generative friction with one another. Some of our collaborators call for justice through everyday acts of care, others through radical, sweeping structural reforms, others through the transformation of legal paradigms, and yet others through micro-biopolitical modes of bettering rather than ending interspecies conflicts. What we're trying to do in this project, I think, comes close to what Marisol de la Cadena might call ontological openings, or practices of thinking together that seek to unsettle assumptions of secure intelligibility of and between more than human worlds, and that also attend critically to the situatedness of justice across often very different sites, subjects, and scales. And this attention to the specificity of justice in space and time resonates with literary studies scholar Ursula Hayes' first formulation of multi-species justices, in the plural, as, quote, the question of what is and is not right to do by other people and species, on what grounds, and how to proceed when our ideas of justice diverge. In thinking with different non-human beings to rethink justice as a concept and as a practice, our collective is very much inspired by the field of multi-species studies, one that foregrounds how symbiotic associations and the mingling of creative, more than human agents generates different kinds of ecological communities. Multi-species approaches, together with consonant currents, including the environmental humanities and post-humanities, take it as their aim to highlight the biological, political, ethical, historical, and cultural dimensions of non-human life and co-living, how these dimensions transform in the context of colonialism, capitalism, and technoscience, and what they enable or disable when it comes to questions of interspecies care, violence, and other often decidedly non-innocent, more than human entanglements. Now, questions of justice and injustice were very much part of the conversation since the inception of multi-species studies back in 2010. But these concerns were very much ancillary to early texts and not a central focus. It is more a recent sympathetic criticism of multi-species studies that has led scholars, including our collective, to more explicitly focus on justice and politics as well as related ethical concerns. Building on an influential and quickly growing body of work, the Promise of Multispecies Justice project then seeks to contribute to these emerging conversations by addressing an array of intersecting questions that complement those that I have mentioned earlier. These include, who are the subjects of justice in our shared world? What is at stake when these subjects are captured by juridical legal systems and/or social movements? Who has claimed a monopoly over what justice is in the past and in the present, and how and whether should we contest their centered propriety in the future? In grappling with these and many other burning questions, the members of our collective remained acutely aware that often it is injustice that is more tangible and visible than justice, whether in human or more than human realms. We were searching here for authors who were focused on situated struggles against ugly injustice, whilst also remaining attentive to the possibility of beauty, of aesthetics, of relationships that remain sources of delight. We sought to cultivate what anthropologist Anna Singh calls arts of noticing. That is to say, an approach that involves paying attention to charismatic life forms, as well as creatures that are often disregarded or actively targeted for destruction, like mushrooms, weeds, rodents, viruses, and many species of insects. And the species of this kind of passionate immersion in the worlds of non-human others, many of our writers were turning away from landscapes that are conventionally regarded as aesthetic, for instance, protected parklands and conservation zones, and instead focusing their attention on sites of abandonment, ruin, and extraction that are so prevalent in the so-called Anthropocene. Toxic waste dumps, urban prisons, industrial plantations, amongst others. It was in these less than charismatic and often deeply violent sites that our collective was seeking to identify feral forms of life as sources of wonder in the midst of dread, and ones that can offer alternative aesthetic and political sensibilities in this age of planetary unraveling. Thinking outside the strictures of formal institutional mechanisms and the law, many of the members in our collective are also seeking out possibilities for justice beyond the human in mundane and modest acts of the everyday, like perceptual attunement to nature, sensory immersion in the environment, bodily engagement with non-human others, and forms of storytelling about, with, and for different more than human worlds. This is a practice anchored then in a deeply sensory, bodily methodology, one that brings us to think about justice not just through what it means or does as an abstract or legal concept, but also what justice feels like, tastes like, sounds like, or smells like across ecologies ruderal, sylvan, oceanic, carceral, and viral, among others. What we're trying to ask is at work in everyday little justice projects. What does this work care about? What animates and compels it? What does this work believe about itself and about others? The idea here then is to try to sense and make sense of justice as a kind of promise, a positionality and a practice, but also to attend to the consequential fault lines that can arise between different justice projects, both small and large. Amidst ongoing struggles over water and gas pipelines in North America, which one of our authors explores, the militarization of indigenous lands in South America and elsewhere in the tropics, as another author explores, and the expansion of mega mines and monocrop plantations in really all parts of the world, the cultural theorist Macarena Gómez Baris has observed that, quote, indigenous and multi-species autonomy and justice are increasingly in peril, end quote. She and many others call for more innovative thinking and writing, quote, against the binary of the human and non-human, end quote. In this age of ecological unmaking, naming different forms of justice and injustice can in some ways produce a sense of action and agency that might allow us to experience the possibility of hope and messy future actions together. As Jessica Greenberg notes, quote, the opposite of justice is not injustice, but despair, end quote. What our project tried to do was to avoid sinking into a paralyzing politics of despair when it seems that nothing can be done. A sense of despair that is particularly prevalent amongst those of us, and I'm including people in the audience right now, who are working on questions of violence and vulnerability in an age of planetary unmaking. Instead, this project is interested in identifying, defining, and indexing multiple species of justice within a broader ecology of more than human sentience, dignity, harms, and violence. Alisa Paredes, for instance, one of our authors, develops in her work the notion of competitive justice to highlight the conflicts among different ideals proliferating within the political asymmetries, contestations, and forms of resistance that often accompany interspecies relationships. Jia Hui Li, another author, offers the notion of generative justice to invite a practice of bottom-up justice-seeking, celebrating the consequential role of bacteria, plants, fungi, insects, and other modest critters within nested loops of multi-species regeneration. Christina Lyons, meanwhile, fleshes out a concept of intergenerational justice that demands that institutions consider carefully the potential impact of their actions on the well-being of future human and non-human generations and their duties and responsibilities to generations and ancestors past. Michael Marder, our philosopher, theorizes in his work multi-world justice as a kind of justice that arises in the course of lived experience, within and at the very edges of dynamic worlds as actualities rather than as potentialities. Justice, as he writes, as what just is, rather than what might be. Shoshana Ihar, another contributor, attends in her work to what she calls small justices. That is to say, forms of justice that take the form of incremental shifts in everyday life, slight alterations, micro-political shifts that might appear deceptively mundane, but that might also act as starting points for new cosmopolitical possibilities. Lastly, Radhika Govindarajan, an anthropologist, offers in her work with the collection the notion of spectral justice, to trouble the boundaries between life, death, and the afterlife in the way we think about relations and existence. In this form of justice, it is the haunting force of ghosts, of the dead and of the killed, that can prompt the living to redress injury and repair damaged relations. Often incomplete and inchoate in both form and substance, spectral justice, Govindarajan argues, involves difficult negotiations across both the immanent and the transcendent realms. So in the course of our trying to think through these various ecologies of justice, the members of this collective also found inspiration in Western continental philosophy and political theory as it relates to non-human rights and capabilities. Philosophers associated with the human animal rights movement, for instance, have drawn on the utilitarian tradition in ethical philosophy to deem actions right or wrong, depending on the extent to which they promote happiness or prevent pain. Justice can be accomplished, according to some utilitarian thinkers, when people intuit the feelings of animals and become advocates for their welfare. Capability-centered approaches to justice, meanwhile, consider the physical, psychological, emotional, and cognitive well-being of animals, as well as their social relationships and ecological interdependencies. Here, practices of so-called sympathetic imagining across gulfs of species difference, and also creative engagements with scientific literature proposed by philosophers like Martha Nussbaum offers fresh perspectives on the flourishing of animals as dignity-bearing subjects, agents, and world makers. The contributors to this volume build on this expansive archive of Western continental philosophy and political theory, whilst also remaining attentive to the ways that justice has been twisted by colonialism, capitalism, and racism. On the margins of banana plantations in the Philippines, for instance, our collaborator Paredes explores justice at the limits of human empathy between species and across species lines. In the mountains of India, Govindarajan invites us to consider what justice might entail when animals who suffer violent deaths along highways and roads haunt the living with their ghostly presence in their sleep. As the US Department of Justice perpetuates the mass incarceration of Black and brown peoples, Elizabeth Lara's essay about prison gardens insists that, quote, the work of abolition is also the work of multi-species justice. But of course, as projects like this, alongside many others led by legal scholars and philosophers, seek to expand the category of rights-bearing subjects to identify animals, plants, rivers, and ecosystems as legal persons, it is absolutely crucial to remember that not all human people are themselves treated as fully human before the law. Alexandre Vechelier, amongst many others, for instance, has described how unequal power structures determine, quote, which humans can lay claim to full human status and which humans cannot, end quote. Colonial constructs of race and nature continue to haunt the cultural politics of identity as terrains of power that operate both within and across species lines. As a result, it is not just some species, but also some kinds of people who continue to be vulnerable to premature death or even targeted for extermination. As open violence is directed at people on account of their blackness, brownness, and queerness, slower forms of violence are incrementally and often imperceptibly disabling and debilitating vulnerable peoples and organisms. For us, multi-species justice thus involves seizing opportunities for intersectional, interspecies, and intraspecies political praxis. Intersectionality, of course, has classically been used as an analytical framework to understand how social and political identities combine to create different lived experiences of discrimination and of privilege. These ideas about intersectional inequalities involving humans and non-humans have recently been explored in the context of a patchy Anthropocene, where concerns are simultaneously people-focused and also engaged with multi-species entanglements. And here we were thinking particularly with the work of anthropologist Anna Singh, who writes about patchiness as being, quote, justice's condition of possibility and its limit at the same time. Patchiness, she writes, operates on an acute awareness of its own limitations, in a register of contingency and potential failure, rather than heroic action or totalizing mastery over reality or knowledge. In an allied spirit, we are interested in patches of justice amidst uneven and growing conditions of unlivability. The species of justice that come together in our work in many ways seek to offer what the critical race theorist Claire Jean Kim calls a multi-optic vision, or a way of seeing that takes different claims about justice seriously without hastily granting undue importance to any one particular approach. This kind of multi-optic vision that for us is very much anchored in a multidisciplinary methodology enables a kind of onto-epistemological unflattening. That is to say, a simultaneous engagement of multiple different vantage points from which we might engender other ways of seeing, imagining, and being in just relation to others and other others. Imagining just futures through this kind of intersectional optic thus demands that we reconsider what constitutes the threshold of injustice, who gets to determine this threshold, and in whose interests. I have been using the pronoun we a lot in my talk so far, but of course, pronouns such as we can be terribly slippery when it comes to imagining shared more than human futures. When we harbor hopes about desirable or undesirable species interactions, about intended or unintended consequences, about moments of justice to come, we're bringing together different communities of us. Multi-species justice then emerges within broader fields of power where who counts in the world and whose world counts is very much at stake. As such, any project that aims to achieve or imagine justice otherwise in multi-species worlds, we argue should take as a premise the question of justice for whom or for what. What counts as nature, at what cost, and to whose benefit. An intersectional approach to the question of multi-species justice, also for many of the contributors to this project, raised some thorny questions around the issue of potentially bad subjects of multi-species justice, entities that cause harm to both human and ecological life worlds, like tsunamis, viruses, invasive rodents, plagues of locusts, earthquakes, and certain germs. What we asked ourselves are we to do, intellectually and practically, with those non-human beings who seem to refuse to comply with or who harm often already vulnerable human communities? How does punitive or retributive justice operate when non-human beings are the perpetrators of such harms? If non-humans should be recognized as subjects of justice, then are they also accountable before justice as potential agents of violence? And if pathogens, weeds, viruses, and other non-compliant organisms can be said to perform their own kinds of injustice by sabotaging landscapes of empire, then how do we recognize the agency of these feral species without romanticizing or celebrating their ferality? These are big questions that none of us seeks to answer in full, but what comes out clearly from the projects is that all ecological communities are filled with predators and with preys, with hosts and with parasites. These are worlds wherein hostility and hostages are embedded in the very heart of interspecies hospitality. The aim here then is to look for alliances that could arise in these always already violent worlds, to think about what symbiosis entails amongst interdependent subjects who may be enemies but also allies. In this thinking, we were very much aligned with the work of philosopher Isabel Stengers, who argues that peace does not exist within ecosystems, and that instead of longing for peace, we should be pursuing ongoing battles for compromise and a less violent distribution of suffering across species lines. This is a kind of cosmopolitical proposal that demands compromise as we learn to live with at times destructive non-human beings who challenge, perhaps, some of our ethics, values, and understandings of what the cosmos is and what a just or unjust relation might look like. So just to close quickly with some concluding thoughts here. In this project that seeks to reclaim the promise of justice, and in some ways the very idea of a multi-species future itself, many of the authors in our collection are finding it important to ground dreams and struggles for justice in the topos of particular territories, whether it's in soils and cities, landscapes or bodies, or technologies and sciences. We argue that justice, like situated knowledge, is always partial, in the sense that it is of some worlds more than for others. Rather than trying to hold justice apart from political struggles, we're looking here to identify moments and opportunities to deconstruct and reconstruct how we understand politics and its relationship to justice, the relationship between technoscience and justice, the relationship between environment and ecology and justice, and the kinds of figures of hope that we can unearth in trying to redistribute violence in multi-species worlds differently. This is an invitation to enter the realms of others who often recognize and move with their own codes of just relations, encoded in wild, wordless fluctuations of animal bites, of scents, of sounds, of temperatures, and even sometimes by trails of significance that we as humans cannot perceive, never mind translate. The essays in this collection are trying to venture into realms beyond dominant sites and scales of Western colonial justice, and instead to follow fainter paths and feral figures into brimming borderlands of ethnographic description and narrative. This involves, in some instances, tracking the movements of ghosts across haunted landscapes, the proliferation of wily weeds and stray dogs, the momentous impacts of viral particles, the fading song of birds on the verge of extinction, the tracing of toxins across chemical milieus, all of which mark new possible trails for the pursuit of justice beyond human domains. At the same time, this is a project that recognizes that there is no one single form of writing or discipline or indeed perspective that can ever hope to hold all of the prickly intersectional knots, alliances, and pulses at play in projects of justice making within different multi-species worlds. In a mode that one of our authors, M.L. Clark, calls inscribing the gap, we're trying here to explore different ways that would-be justice makers might broaden our senses of jurisdiction, as in jurisdiction, or who claims authority to speak the laws of the land. These then are experimental forays that remind readers that no one authority can ever say what it is just for all lives in any given situation. Looking around, taking inventory of contemporary conditions, it is easy to slip into paralyzing feelings of despair. We live in an era of self-devouring growth, as Julie Livingston reminds us, with the expansion of capital's markets undermining conditions of life on Earth. Atmospheric conditions are shifting, making it increasingly difficult for all of us to breathe. As the privileged create cosmopolitan refuges in growing deserts and safe bubbles in viral pandemics, other people and creatures are living through endless wars. Industrial processes are rapidly uncoupling life from death, diminishing death's capacity to channel vitality back to the living. What then might it mean to imagine a field of justice where multiple species circulate, cradle to cradle? One where the oikos of the household is in dynamic equilibrium with interlocking ecological systems and economic circuit. Within this field, justice will be slippery and spectral. It will shift and morph across time, space, and species, resisting institutional capture or indeed human mastery. This is a kind of justice that is unpredictable in the world, as both actuality or potentiality manifest through events, instances, and provisional judgments. Taken together, what the work of this project tries to do is to, in many ways, tell stories of multi-species justice that jump across scales, sites, and domains, moving constantly from abstract speculation to situated political action and material interventions, and then back again. The idea here is to explore ways of thinking about justice in polymorphic situations, where calculations are never perfect and often open to reinterpretation. Part of this work is asking deeper ecological questions about what, how, and by whom the laws and languages of any land or system of justice are comprised, and who gets to be part of the decisions when it comes to determining what justice is and who its subject is. But I think one of the takeaways from the volume, if not institutional solutions or answers to the matter of multi-species injustice, is that it is possible to care for particular forms of life and biocultural communities, while at the same time holding on to promises of sweeping change on future horizons. These are approaches to multi-species justice that are very much anchored in the practice of being open and alive to the generative possibilities of each encounter with the non-human world in our own everyday existences. It's an approach that demands that we decide what dreams are worth dreaming, and by extension, which injustices we consider to be intolerable. As such, it is also an invitation to think about justice through a renewal of our commitment to love, to live, and also to fight for the possibility of just flourishings in more than human worlds, both present and to come. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Usually I ask people to just take like a couple of minutes break just to stretch ourselves and, you know, gather a little bit our thoughts and then come fresh to questioning. So just take a couple of minutes, turn off your cameras, and then I'd like everyone, if possible, to turn on our cameras at the next phase and start a conversation, okay? So I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone, whenever you're ready to turn on cameras again. Let's wait a couple minutes. Really nice to see many of you here. Yeah, it's an open invitation for everyone to turn on our cameras. And thank, first of all, Sophie, for this wonderful presentation and really thought-provoking paper. Shall I start us off, or does one of you? Oh, nice shirt, Rebecca. Want to just share their first impressions? And it's a wonderful paper, and of course a wonderful volume, Sophie. So of course, for us to really appreciate what you're presenting, one can, you know, I encourage everyone to read the book. I don't have it right here; it's in the other room. But yes, Sophie, maybe you can show us your volume. I, for myself, was very interested. Yes. Very nice cover. We invited Sophie because of this really important and difficult question of how one can be just to non-human others. I mean, let alone human others. So it's a philosophical question. I mean, that has been eternal in some ways question for humans, and thinking about ethics and what's the right thing to do, and how do we act right, how do we become virtuous, and also many theories within philosophy, and also much outside whatever it is that we now call philosophy or practice as philosophy. I'm just focusing on philosophy because my own training is in that field. But yeah, so I really love this idea of an ecology of justices, and I think that's seems to me like a very generative way to move on this issue, like from a sort of philosophy of science perspective, and this kind of pluralistic approach to developing more and new concepts of what justice might be. To see, it seems like a really important step in acknowledging that this is not a once and forever, you know, kind of, we're going to define it and we're going to, you know, measure it and we're going to enforce it kind of situation, right? So to allow for a flexibility and a pluralism that helps us to align, I guess, also what you said, like our sensibilities, our sensitivities, and what it feels like to be just, with also our frames or our understanding of how to act well. You mentioned specifically that at the start of your talk, and here's a question, that the current Western frames of thinking about justice are not enough, not adequate. And I was wondering if you could be more precise about that, or more specific in giving an example. I mean, you mentioned some of the utilitarian, for example, theories, or you mentioned Nussbaum as more perhaps a promising and capabilities approach. I know that work is more recent. But did you have other frames in mind? Is it the anthropocentrism kind of in the history of these frames that is the main obstacle? And can you move beyond that and still use some of these frames? Or, I mean, I've done some of that, well, with Levinas, with Emmanuel Levinas. It's not, I guess he's within the continental tradition. He doesn't write about animals, but I have found some of his ideas productive, like he talks about the face and facing and kind of ethics as a phenomenological phenomenon. And as actually he uses ethics as first philosophy, so he builds his whole understanding of the world on ethics and on encounters. So, you know, this is a person who was writing in a sexist, like, you know, he's not a philosopher who you would read and say, okay, I agree with everything you're saying, but there's still some value in, I think, in some of these ideas. And I'm wondering a little bit about how you know, how you orient yourself to that type of tradition, and how or whether there is something to find and there in your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for getting us started with that question, Sophia.
Rambling,
yeah,
so
really...
but yeah.
No worries, it's all good. Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate your picking up on this sort of thinking about justice as a justice multiple, to riff off Anne-Marie Moll's language, right? To sort of move beyond this idea that it's singular or static, but rather that it's situated in space and time and across different particular kinds of contexts. And, you know, I think the kind of work that we were doing in that collective was trying to bring Western theories of justice into conversation with indigenous ways of understanding what just coexistence and what just co-living might mean, not least because there are you know, some significant differences between, you know, what I would identify as the more kind of, as you said, anthropocentric and individual focused subject of a lot of Western dominant traditions or theorizations of justice, and the much more relational sort of kinship anchored ways of thinking about just coexistence, and that are at the heart of so many indigenous ontoepistemologies. And in fact, you know, whilst many of us were trying to think with Western theories of justice, many of us actually found the very language of justice incredibly slippery. We would, you know, we'd be thinking about justice, and then we'd find ourselves slipping into the language of care, or the language of respect, or reciprocity, or companionship. You know, so other kinds of idioms that do a different kind of conceptual affective labor, and that we were trying to kind of bring to the fold of our thinking about justice, whilst also taking seriously, what is it about justice? What does justice do that is more than care, right? Should I have to care about a feral species in order to engage with it in a way that is just, right? Do my feelings matter to this interaction, in this situation? So that was one of the spaces of kind of productive tension, I suppose, that arose. But, you know, a lot of the thinking we were doing was trying to think about the challenges and kind of adopting a kind of expansionist approach to theories, you know, Western theories of justice that are human-centric. And what became really, really clear is that some of the really radical differences between human and non-human life forms means that it's not just a project of expanding the subject and just continuing the same kind of frame of justice. It was really that how we understand justice as a practice has to shift, right? And for many of us, a big part of that was, well, what about if we stop thinking about a particular entity as a subject of justice? What about instead of thinking about that entity as the subject, we think about the relation as a subject? So what would a law look like where the subject of justice is, for instance, predation in the context of hunting, or domestication in the context of relationships with livestock, or petship when it's the context of living with a companion species in the domus, right? What if that relation was the subject? Now, how that would actually translate institutionally and jurisdictionally speaking is a whole other question, which we didn't explore in the depth that we could have in this particular project, but that others are. But it was really trying to take seriously that relationality as the premise and the promise of other ways of thinking about justice beyond entities, if you wish. And I think another big part of our pushback against certain Western theories of justice was, even in a sort of capabilities approach framework, there is an assumption that one can know what the affordances and needs of the non-human other are. And for many of us, respecting the unknowability, the often incommensurability, the radical alterity of many non-human beings is just as important to the project of recognition as is the protection of their rights and the recognition of their affordances, right? So accepting and acknowledging unknowability for us was a big part of a kind of ethic of respect when it comes to thinking across species lines, if you wish. Again, how that translates in practical terms into sort of legal or institutional systems is a whole different question. And I'd love to hear the thoughts of people who are working at sort of more institutional policy level space. But we were trying to also, I guess, push against the assumption of mastery, knowing as a form of mastery when it comes to more than human rules. That so much remains beyond the bounds of the laws and the language that we use to talk about and interact with and communicate interspecies relationships in everyday life.
Thank you. Thank you. Several interesting points. I saw Chrysula have her hand up, then Tamsin, and then Dimitris. So, Chrysula, please feel free to introduce yourself, say where you're based before asking a question. Can you see how to unmute, or maybe not? Okay.
Type your question in the chat box, Chrysula, if the audio is not working.
And Tamsin, if you wanted to ask your question while we're waiting for Chrysula.
Sure, thank you. So hi, I'm Tamsin. I work at the University of Oxford as part of a group called Tables. So we explore different perspectives on food systems and debates around the kind of impacts of the food system. So I particularly work on a focus of my work has been different narratives of history, how people understand the kind of the problems that they're facing in food systems as a result of histories told in very different ways. So we've got the kind of history of human progress and flourishing on the one hand, and maybe the neatest counter to that is this kind of conservation, the history that comes out of conservation movement of kind of progressive human destruction of the environment. And I wondered if from this project of thinking through the lens of multi-species justice, did that lead you to any story of human history? Does that lead you to any kind of history of how we've got to where we are that could tell us something new or give us a different way to think?
Awesome. Thank you so much for the question, Tamsin, and I'd love to hear more about your research in a separate conversation. I think a lot of us were, trying to think with Dipe Chakrabarti and Bruno Latour, right, and trying to collapse that distinction between natural and human history, and taking sort of the broader frame of the Anthropocene, or however else one wants to call the present juncture, as a kind of a diagnostic moment to rethink those sorts of binaries in the first place. But that being said, certainly a lot of the papers in this collection, in the book, are situating sort of forms of injustice in the present within much longer histories of, in the case of our book, racial colonial capitalism, and sort of intersections of those sorts of different forms of violence. And that includes, of course, thinking about conservation as also in some ways an expression of, particular understandings of progress and of the wild, and of what deserves and does not deserve to be preserved or conserved, and by whom, right? And the kind of silencing and exclusion of other ways of thinking about, relationships between the wild, the human, the non-human, nature, and so forth. So I think, some of those questions around, I love your invitation to think about the ways in which histories get told in different ways, and how that inflects the kind of political and ethical valences of what might consider just or unjust. One thing that certainly came out really strongly from the project was that many of the authors were bringing these different ways of thinking about histories of multi-species injustice, whether it's in the context of enslavement, mining, plantation, colonialism, and others, into dialogue with kind of speculative futures, right? Thinking about the ways in which different human communities don't just, present their own understandings of historicity as a form of epistemic self-determination or epistemic justice seeking, but also in the process are experimenting and tinkering with speculative futures as to what flourishing might mean, often in the ruin and the rubble of colonialism's afterlives, right? So there was a kind of multi-temporal ethic, I suppose, of the project, which by the same token was trying to rethink the sort of past, present, futureness of linear temporality as well, right? How is history repeating itself? What kind of ancestors do we want to become? In what ways are certain futures already foretold? How are these futures in some ways latent? In what ways do multi-species injustice invite us to think about the future as a future anterior, that which will already have been, right? So kind of playing and tinkering with the very kind of linearity of time, I think, was a big part of that project as well. So I don't know if that answer did justice to your question, but it's a really, really great one. So thank you so much, Tamsin.
And maybe Chrysoula, you're able to ask the question now? No, we still can't. But can you type in the chat? Okay. So then we go to Dimitris Barlis.
Thank you so much for giving me the right to pose my question. I don't know if you can hear me initially. Okay, that's great. Because I'm asking you because I thought that I had an issue with my earbuds. So I'm sorry. Good morning. To introduce myself, my name is Dimitris, and I'm a third-year university student in the History and Philosophy of Science faculty in Athens University. And I would like to pose a question about what Ms. Chao said. The viewpoint, the main viewpoint of what you completely said, was the thresholds between non-human beings and human beings, and all those aspects combined together so as to have a completely switchable environment for both the one side and the other side also. And I would like to ask you if there are some specific prerequisites to pose those thresholds between non-human beings and human beings altogether.
Thank you,
I don't know
Dimitris,
if you heard.
for your
I don't know
question.
if you heard me, Ms. Chao.
Yeah, so I think I understood, if I understood correctly, the question was whether there are certain specific prerequisites for
Yeah, exactly.
just coexistence across these kind of human, non-human differences and divides.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's a really brilliant question, Dimitris. Part of me wants to direct you away from this volume, which I would say offers far less in terms of answers to questions like the ones you've just raised, and instead raises a lot more questions around what justice is and does. And the collection that I would point you to that is doing that work of thinking about, I suppose, what we could call some, basic or transposable or scalable principles of justice, is a collection that came out last year called Multispecies Justice in a journal called Cultural Politics. And I actually co-edited that one with a political theorist called Danielle Sellemeyer, who is doing much more work on the kind of space of institutionalizing multi-species justice, right? So kind of moving beyond the sort of, sort of conceptual thinking around justice and instead thinking about what it means in practice. And that's really where, ideas of prerequisites and principles come to the fore. I mean, I think there's a lot of people doing work in this space. So just to pick up on a few things that are coming out quite strongly in terms of prerequisites. The first is that there is no such thing as an individual or individuated subject of justice, because every single organism, human or other, comes into being through its relationships to other organisms, to elements, to ecosystems, and so forth, right? So there is no way of thinking about justice outside of the relationships that make any organism possible and their life meaningful or sustainable, if you wish. The second principle that seems to be coming out really strongly from kind of recent theorizations of multi-species justice is a need to kind of really take seriously the kind of needs of different organisms, right? Biological needs, ecosystemic needs, and not just needs that help keep them alive, but make their life worth living. There's a distinction there, right? You can keep bare life alive, but living needs more than that, right? And that applies not just to us as humans, but also to non-human beings. So thinking through the thresholds of bare life and a meaningful life or a good life, and by extension, perhaps also a good death. Love to hear thoughts on that from people in the MEATigation project, is another kind of prerequisite that's come into the fold. And the third prerequisite that's really coming out strongly, certainly from our work, is that, which human voices get to be part of decisions around what justice is, who distributes it, are just as important as considering non-human entities' needs and affordances, right? There are very different ways of conceptualizing justice, but there are also hierarchies of dominance in terms of whose take on justice comes to take precedence, right? Part of the point of this project is to foreground Indigenous and other non-Western theories of justice as a way of kind of leveling out that playing field. So that question of thinking carefully about which humans get to be part of the conversation about the non-human is a huge part also of the sort of thinking around the principles and the premises of rebuilding justice together otherwise, right? And those kinds of questions are linked to decolonizing justice, and they're particularly important for people like myself who live and work on settler colonized lands in Australia, where thinking and working from a place like here is just indissociable from thinking and working with the people who have long been silenced, or excluded from dominant imaginaries of justice and the law. Those are three principles that seem to be like much more explicitly, Dimitris, if you're interested. So drop me an email.
Yes, okay. Maybe I didn't catch the middle one. First, you said no justice out of the relationships between humans and non-humans. And the second one was limits between how to live your life well, let's say, and the other one, because I didn't catch it, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about which humans get to be part of the conversation around what multi-species justice is. Secondly, thinking carefully about not just what makes non-human life livable, but what makes it worth living, right? So to take it beyond bare survival and existence to actual flourishing, and sustainable, meaningful non-human life and relationships, if you wish. And the third, can't remember what the third one was. It was the first one originally, but that slipped my mind. Did you get the first one?
Yes, I just noted here in my notebook that there was no justice out of the relationships background between non-humans and human beings.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So
Okay.
moving beyond the idea of the subject of justice as an individual, and instead thinking about any individual as a set or an assemblage or a composite of relations, each of which need to be sustained in order for that individual to come into being and experience becoming and also belonging.
I also have another question, Mistress, about the general function of society in conjunction with the first question I posed to you. In case of some specific norms violation, either from the one side or from the other side, what should a society do? What should a society, I'm sorry, do in the case of a specific norms violation, being able to harm either a little bit or to a large extent the whole society. What should a specific society do in this case?
Okay. I just want to first say that I realize we're 11 minutes over time, so I don't want anyone to feel like they need to go to have to be captive to this conversation. And the second thing, I just want to thank Graham for dropping those wonderful thoughts and also sources in the chat room, which I'm going to download straight away to follow up on. Thank you so much for that, Graham. Dimitris, I didn't quite, was the question, what should a society do if there are violations in norms surrounding multi-species relationships?
Right.
Or I mean, I think the short answer to your question is that it really depends on the society in question, right? And who has the power to speak with or for or against, for that matter, whatever multi-species relationship or entity has been harmed or done injustice to, right? So again, we're back to this question of context and situatedness and moving away from, any possibility of a universal or scalable understanding of what a solution is, right? But I think, thinking with the project that we've been doing that has been really interested in indigenous theories and practices of justice, there are all kinds of systems of, punitive justice, retributive justice, restorative justice, both in Western and non-Western systems of systems of the law, right? So looking to the existing protocol that might exist, I think is one thing. But the other issue, I think, is that violation of norms, the language we're using assumes that we recognize those violations as violations in the first place, right? Whereas in many contexts, injustice towards the non-human world is very much naturalized or normalized. It is not considered to be a violation. It's effectively considered to be an expression of, perhaps the right of humans to exert a kind of supremacy or control over the non-human, right? So I think your question is a great prompt in the sense that it invites us to rethink or not take for granted what is considered a violation or an injustice in the very first place, because that can look and sound and feel and mean something very, very different depending on who you're asking.
Hello. Hi. Hi, Sophia. Hi, everyone. Hi, Sophie. So my dear Sophia tells me that she cannot unmute herself. So she's asking me if I could read one of the questions in the chat. So let me see. Thank you. I don't know. Okay, so there are no questions, right? Oh, there is a question by Chrysula. Did she read that question? Not yet. I'm going to read out loud this question. So Chrysula asks, do you think Western legal culture eventually incorporates this variety of images, assemblies, and narratives of justice? And she means that by taking under consideration the processes that followed about the recognition of legal status in Whanganui River in New Zealand, where this river was recognized as a multifaceted subject of rights and obligations. That's interesting, rights and obligations through its history and traditions.
Yeah, fabulous. I'm so sorry, Sophia, that you've been muted against your will. It's awful. You might want to make me co-host, and then if you want to log off and log back in, we can continue and you can try and figure things out. Chrysula, thank you for your question. Also, sorry, we can't kind of be in a live conversation. It's a brilliant question. I mean, I think the example of the Whanganui River, alongside so many examples of, recognition of non-human personhood, have very much been spearheaded by non-Western collectives and coalitions who are doing that work of not sort of, throwing Western legal culture out of the bathwater, but on the contrary, trying to forge exactly the kind of interlegal dialogue that is needed in trying to, come up with other ways of living justly in always already shared worlds, right? So the Whanganui River is a fantastic example. And I think, there is growing interest, certainly, people whom I work with, who work with practitioners in the law, in Western domains. There is a curiosity and a recognition that that things can't go on the way that they're going on, right? That the Anthropocene is, if anything, a real call to action and a stimulus for transformation and reimaginations that cannot be anchored in a kind of fixed Western, non-Western divide, right? The whole idea is we do this work together. So it's intercultural and it's multicultural as much as it is multi-species, if you wish. I think it'll take time. And I think the biggest question for a lot of Indigenous activists and lawyers who have been involved in rights of nature movements and ecological law is the extent to which they will continue to be recognized as having set that precedent in rights of nature and, an awareness of the risks of rights of nature, sort of like justice becoming co-opted by particular institutional or transgovernmental systems and regimes and infrastructures that will then not center, but rather, again, kind of silence or sideline the sort of Indigenous practices and philosophies that these movements are rooted in. So it's all in the making. It's a really interesting space to be observing at the moment, for sure. This question of obligations alongside rights is absolutely fascinating to me. What obligations does the river have to me, or a tsunami for that matter, or a virus? I want to do a lot more thinking in that space. I know others are, but I think the changes in Western legal culture are happening. They're happening slowly, and those changes are being spearheaded as much by Indigenous scholars as by Western legal scholars and social legal scholars who are in conversation with policymakers beyond the ivory tower, including people like Danielle Sellemeyer, whom I just mentioned, whose work I would strongly encourage anyone interested in that to look into, because it's incredibly rich and super politically engaged as well. Thanks, Chrysula.
Thank you, everyone. It's time to finish. Yes. Sophia, what happened? It was your Zoom took over. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So Sophia says to everyone, thank you so very much for your questions, especially Sophie. Thank you so very much for another wonderful, wonderful intervention. So rich. It's always a pleasure to hear you, Sophie. I always take so many notes. I always get so inspired when I hear you. I always feel that the world can be, thought differently when I hear you, Sophia. So what a pleasure, goosebumps and
Thank you.
And yeah, be in touch with Mitigation, wonderful project of Sophia's and her team. And what else can I say, Sophia?
Thank you very much, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking over the reins of the hosting. Thank you, Sophia Efstathiou, for opening this space for conversation. And I just want to say I might be living halfway across the world, but I'm only ever just an email away. So if anybody does want to continue the dialogue, I'd be really, really happy to. And I will most certainly be following MEATigation work.
Sophie, we are really grateful. That has been a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day and enjoy your summer.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.